Good morning, Liberty. It is Friday morning, December the 14th, 2018. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live. We are live here from my home office and studio here on the West Coast, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time in downtown Los Angeles. So good morning to you, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be watching or listening, whether you're watching videos through YouTube, BitChute, Brighteon, or elsewhere, or listening to the podcast, which is now on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify, and we're going to expand that beyond that pretty soon. I do want to apologize in advance if we have any construction happening during this show. They started building a new restaurant right below me. I used to live on a higher floor in my previous place, but now being on floor 2 means sometimes I run into these construction issues, so they've been doing a little bit of drilling here and there. So if you hear something crazy, no one's busting down the door this time. We can laugh about it a little bit. So over in the live chat on YouTube, hi to Idamon, EHP Training, George McClellan, States Rights Gist, Ward Lawrence and Joseph Standridge, and everybody else who are watching live, or if you're watching later on the archives. I really appreciate you being here with me today. So tomorrow, December the 15th, is the anniversary, is Bill of Rights Day. It's the anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, December 15th, 1791. And I know that, my Constitution Day episode, I basically pointed out that most of the time they treat these days, like Constitution Day, for example, as kind of a trivia day. Like Constitution Day, for example, they mandate, it's an unconstitutional federal government mandate to the unconstitutional federally funded education public school system to teach about the Constitution. And what do they teach about the Constitution? Not the basis, not the structure, not the struggles that they went through, the experience of the pre-revolutionary and the revolutionary times and the early days of the Articles, for example. They don't teach any of that. They teach you trivia. So basically, all that the Constitution matters to the government school system is who gets to serve in office, how many terms, how many years, how old they have to be, what's a senator versus a representative, what political parties, blah, blah, blah. They don't really teach the structure. So that's what I want to get into today regarding the Bill of Rights and Bill of Rights Day, December 15th. Because in the Bill of Rights, that's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, is the 10th, which is what my organization is all about, the 10th Amendment Center. And this is a very important thing, not just because I happen to like it. I picked up on it because I thought there was a need for conversations regarding the limited nature of the powers delegated to the federal government. Oh, and I forgot, and thanks to Woodsider over in the live chat, if you are watching or listening, if you're listening live, watching live, in the archives, it doesn't matter. Make sure you smash that like button, because every time you do that, it tells whatever platform you're watching or listening on that you like what we're doing and you want other people to hear about it. It makes it more likely that they will show it, whether in sidebars or in searches and the like. And we are getting more and more views and more subscribers every day. And we're getting more views and listens to older episodes and older videos as well, which is very positive, which means more people are discovering the content. I also want to say hi to Bob Brewer, and I appreciate everyone stopping by. So rather than, I failed to keep up with my promise of having a nice quote of the day for every episode, and I really want to get back to that. But I want to start out with it today rather than ending. And today I want to start out with Thomas Jefferson, because it really ties into this conversation about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, especially the 10th, and the foundation of the Constitution. He put together an opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank on February 15th, 1791. And one of his big statements against it was just very straightforward, in that they weren't delegated a power to do this. And this is what he said. Let me pull this up for people who are watching on video. I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people, which is almost verbatim the 10th Amendment as ratified 10 months later it was presented, the Bill of Rights was presented, was a long process back in September of 1789, I believe. September 25th, I believe, was the date. And it went through the process of ratification through the states. So this was a very popular item. And in fact, it was one of the main items that actually got the Constitution ratified. And I'm going to touch on it briefly of what happened in Massachusetts, which really got the ball rolling on pushing for this particular statement. At the end of this, Jefferson put in brackets Amendment 12, because there were 12 amendments that were proposed, 10 ended up being approved in short term. One other one was much later on. So again, the foundation of the Constitution, according to Thomas Jefferson, and I know he's one guy, but Thomas Jefferson's views were far from alone. And if he was talking about this in regards to the constitutionality of a national bank, this was a very popular leader of the time, a popular thinker. He was far from alone in this view. I also want to point out, before we get into that the Bill of Rights itself has its own preamble, which also kind of ties into this. And we did a video on this and posted, it's like 3 minutes or so, a couple of months back here on YouTube, and you can find it on our other channels as well. I have the link to it, to our members site and the YouTube, in the show notes. And of course, you can find all of our show notes and all of our archives at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. I'm actually trying to figure out right now, I've been in the process of figuring out how to take that archive page. It's considered on WordPress a category archive page, and customize it without having to do a bunch of redirects and things like that. We do our site in Divi, and Divi is really, really good as a site builder for building all kinds of stuff and making it clean and fast. We really sped up the site in the recent year or so. But as far as category archives, it's just non-existent. You can't really do anything. It's basically just a grid of previous posts. And what I really want to do on that page at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty is have basically a header at the top that explains what the show is, talks about when you can hear it, and then give all the links right on the top for where people can subscribe, because that will help us boost our numbers. And then people can go through the archives. But I'm rambling on that. So the Bill of Rights has its own preamble. And we did this video called The Other Preamble. It's actually 2 minutes, 1 minute and 57 seconds long. And I think this just kind of reiterates Jefferson's view. The second sentence of Section 1 tells us what the ratifications of the amendments was intended to do. And it says this, quote, "The conventions of a number of the states having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added." The point being, just like Jefferson said, they wanted to add additional restrictions on the power of the federal government, and that's what they passed in the Bill of Rights. And basically everybody was saying, you got to have something that makes it very clear that only the federal government can only exercise those powers that were delegated to it in the Constitution. This was basically taken from a clause in the Articles of Confederation. It was a little bit different in how it was worded, but it was the basic foundational principle. And Ben Lewis, who has not blogged for us for quite a while, really awesome dude in Ohio, wrote an article back in 2013 talking about this. The 10th Amendment is the foundation. And again, he goes into, first of all, we can read through the text of the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It's the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments. And Ben points out what I just mentioned. Thomas Jefferson, quote, considered these words, the 10th Amendment, to be the foundation of the Constitution. In reality, Ben writes, the 10th Amendment is much more than that. It is nothing less than the foundation of the entire American experiment, based on the principles of the American Revolution. Now, of course, we're going to talk like this. We're the 10th Amendment Center. We want to hype up our own, right? But really, it's in the legal world, the 10th Amendment is a rule of construction, and so is the 9th. It doesn't add any new powers. It doesn't subtract any new powers. It clarifies the legal doctrine of what some people might call positive grant. It clarifies the legal doctrine of how to read the entire document. So every clause, every piece, every amendment is read under the scope of the 9th and 10th Amendments. That is, just because it's not listed there does not mean there's not that people don't have other rights. That's the 9th. And the 10th, that instead of saying, okay, this is a kind of a list of all the things that people can do, no, this is a list of restrictions on the power of the federal government and powers that the federal government can actually exercise. And if it's not listed there, if it's not expressly delegated, as many founders put it, then they can't do it. And I actually think I started off by reading that backwards, going through that backwards. So there were a lot of concerns during the state ratification debates regarding the powers of the federal government. They were very concerned, and a lot of people, Federalists, over and over kept saying, no, don't worry about it. This is how it's going to be. They can't do things that have not been delegated to them. But as Ben notes, despite these assurances, he wrote, many of the Constitution's opponents were unconvinced. James Wilson, a delegate to South Carolina's ratification convention, charged that the Constitution, quote, totally changes the form of your present government. What have you been contending for these 10 years past? Liberty. What is liberty? The power of governing yourselves. They thought that in the unamended state, and in many of the ratification debates, they talked about the Constitution as it is now proposed. In other words, should we ratify this without amendments? We don't think it's good as is. And so many of the state ratification debates and the ratification documents specifically said, we approve this provided we're getting amendments. And here are a list of amendments. And Ben talks about this as well in his article. The solution to the disagreement came from the ratification conventions of several states, which suggested the inclusion of amendments that would clearly delineate the restrictions on the federal government's power. Massachusetts was the first state to recommend amendments, and as the right to self-government was the keystone of the American political tradition, an amendment protecting that right was placed first in its list of recommendations. The greatest place to get this story is a book by Pauline Maier called, I can't even think of it off the top of my head. It'll pop into my head here. I've got it here in my phone. Let me see if I can pull this up. I'm just going to take a moment here. Oh, it's called Ratification. Pauline Maier's Ratification. It's a narrative story about the process and the history of the ratification through the ratification debates. And when she gets to Massachusetts, it's really interesting because they talk about the opposition. This is kind of the home to the old revolutionaries, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, John Adams, people who were famous, really well known for their opposition to the British, and who led the revolution and the efforts in Boston. And there were people there from the Stamp Act protests. I mean, these are well-respected people. And it was a great concern whether or not the Constitution would be ratified by Massachusetts. It was relatively early on. And if Massachusetts didn't, they thought, well, then dominoes would fall for sure. Virginia wouldn't go along. And then New York was a shoo-in to fail. New Hampshire, it was done. So that was one of the earliest and most critical turning points. And Samuel Adams and John Hancock really kind of made the deal done there. They basically stayed quiet through most of the ratification, but some people came up to John Hancock in private, who was ill. He had gout, and he died early. But they basically came to these guys and said, look, what if we can work out a deal where we conditionally ratify here in Massachusetts? We'll ratify provided that we recommend amendments. Now, the Federalist advocates for a long time didn't want any of this. They basically thought that that would throw the whole thing into not being able to ratify, that if you proposed amendments in one state, then they had to match in all of them, or if then they wanted to call for the amendments in advance, then there would have to be another convention. So they really were opposed to this process all along until people like Hancock and Sam Adams came on board and said, look, we're not going to get this through here in Massachusetts. And if we don't get it through in Massachusetts, you guys know what's going to happen. So we want to recommend amendments. So they put together a bunch of them. But the first one was this, and Ben Lewis covers this in his article. The convention advised, quote, first, that it be explicitly declared that all powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved to the several states. to be by them exercised. Short version, the 10th Amendment. So Massachusetts, which was about to reject the Constitution, which would have likely ended in the Constitution not getting ratified or having to go to another convention. Who knows what would have happened at that point? They were on the verge of rejecting it. They said, look, we'll do it as long as number one, they had a bunch of other ones, but as long as number one on our list, we make it very clear that the power is not delegated to the federal government. That's it. If they're not delegated, then it's in the hands of the people of the states. And that's what Thomas Jefferson down in Virginia took to the public for the next couple of years. And he talked about this in his opinion against the constitutionality of the National Bank, even before the Bill of Rights was said and done in stone later that year. Ben points out that Massachusetts wasn't alone. This created basically an avalanche of recommended amendments. But really, the 10th, or this idea of positive grant, expressly delegated power and reserve power, was really at the top of the list almost everywhere. He notes that the conventions of New Hampshire, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia included similar language in their ratification documents. There were clearly not He should have said they were clearly not idle suggestions, and it is highly doubtful that the Constitution would have been ratified in several of these states, including the influential state of Virginia, had this clarification of the state's powers not been agreed upon. It's my view, and a lot of people talk about Virginia as being basically the fulcrum, or New York, New Hampshire maybe, because New Hampshire actually convened twice in the whole ratification process. But I hold the view that it was really Massachusetts that was the turning point, just because of the respect of the old guard revolutionaries there, and because they were the first to, basically change the process, which turned the tide. Because there were basically three camps. There were the Federalist camp, and Federalists and Anti-Federalists were really kind of the wrong terms. They were terms of propaganda, because Anti-Federalists believed they were Federalists, and that the Federalists were more nationalist in their scope. I mean, compared to what we have today, they were all very federal in their approach, decentralized. They were all tenthers compared to what we have today, except maybe Alexander Hamilton, because he just kept pushing for more and more central power no matter what. So it's my view that it was Massachusetts. So Federalists were the ones who really wanted to basically have it ratified as it. They had to have it exactly as done because they feared what might happen logistically if they did not get it approved like that. And then there were Anti-Federalists who just wanted to reject it. They thought it was dangerous across the board. There was also kind of a smaller number. But there was kind of this moderate middle ground who was like, okay, we believe there is time for a change. We want to see it change. We don't like what they have given us exactly as it is, but we'll be okay with it as long as we get assurances, and we all kind of trust each other to a degree at this stage. We'll agree to it if we get assurances of changes. And the combination of that group plus the Anti-Federalists was almost certain. They were doing counts, and you can read this in Pauline Maier's book, Ratification. When they were doing counts, they were really expecting to lose at many points in the process. But once Massachusetts came on board recommending this Bill of Rights, basically, and the 10th Amendment, then the tide turned, and we saw many other states that were basically on the fence get on board, and that really was the impetus for getting things passed. And that's why I think Jefferson's statement is so powerful, because if it wasn't for inclusion of the 10th Amendment, this principle, the 10th Amendment just expressly stated what Federalists claimed the system was based on anyways. They would say, this is unnecessary. You don't need to include this whole Bill of Rights. You don't need this 10th Amendment because this is a grant of power to a federal government, and that's just how it works. So they wanted everyone to just understand this. That was common knowledge. But the people who opposed that just as is ratification, they recognized that people would misconstrue it in the future, and they wanted to put it down on paper to make it more clear. Woodsider says, at least we still have the third. Well, most of them have been absolutely destroyed, and I think that goes into an entirely different episode, which I did recently on James Madison's advice, which is constitutions don't enforce themselves. And you can have the greatest piece of paper, the greatest formulation for government, the greatest document available. And it does nothing on its own. It really takes a population that's educated on the structure of that government, on that document, and that's in favor of liberty to want to limit the power of government. Without human action, words on paper do nothing. And in fact, many of the founders, James Madison most famously, continually referred to the Constitution itself as a, quote, mere parchment barrier. Hi to Justin Bayola over in the chat. Thank you for joining even though late. Bob Brewer as well. Kenneth Jackson, appreciate you for smashing, liking, and favoriting all of it. That is pretty awesome. And back over to Ben Lewis's article before we cut it a little shorter than normal today. Ben points out that today our impulse is to address the problems created by centralized power by using the central power itself, an impulse that is a little like attempting to cure a snake bite by letting the snake bite you once again. So everyone believes, well, not everyone, but the vast majority of people believe that every time there is a problem, it has to be solved by more government. But the problem is when you go to the federal government to limit the powers of the federal government continues to grow and grow and grow. Now, both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison warned us about this in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. You shouldn't be surprised when the government is the one to determine the extent of its own powers, that those powers would always grow, no matter what kind of separations, powers you have, elections, doesn't matter. And that's how things have played out today, because people have relied too long on government to limit itself. So, one other thing. There was another really good article from Kevin Guttman that we published all the way back in 2009, one of our earlier articles on this, and he kind of makes this statement too, similar to what Woodsider says. At least we still have the third. He says the Bill of Rights should be mourned, not celebrated. It is defunct. Intended as the bulwark of the right of decentralized self-government. He's focusing on the idea of decentralization. Again, 9th and 10th Amendments working in conjunction to say we have more rights than are listed in here, and you can only do what's listed in there. Kevin continues, it now serves mainly as an excuse for the opposite, a roving judicial veto of state policies that federal judges dislike. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it insightful. I like to talk about some of this kind of ratification, the old history of how things came to be, the basis, the principles, because if we understand the principles behind why they made these choices or how it came to be, we have a better understanding of how it's supposed to play out. And then, of course, if we know how it's supposed to play out or how things are supposed to be, the amount of power that the federal government is supposed to have, we recognize that basically everything that they do is a violation of the limits on their power, and we're justified in resisting at every single turn. Theophilus Parsons at the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, the one that I believe turned the tables, he said that a usurpation of power is void on its face as soon as it's done. And any man, he said, will be justified in its resistance. Justified in its resistance. And maybe that'll be our quote of the day along with Thomas Jefferson. So I appreciate you joining me and watching and all the comments. Some interesting stuff from Bob and Justin, Kenneth, Ward, Woodsider, Idemont, EHP Training, George McClellan. EHP, heads up if you're still watching, make sure to keep me in the loop on, you had mentioned a constitutional carry bill to be introduced in Alabama. So make sure to keep me in the loop on that. So I appreciate all of you, Joseph Standridge as well, who are here with me live. And even if you're not commenting, I appreciate you being here. And I appreciate everybody who's watching later on in the archives as well. So make sure to smash that like, share the link, leave some more comments, whether it's here live or later on in the archives, or feel free to shoot me an email to team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you have ideas on things that you'd like me to cover. Next week, I have some plans to talk about asset forfeiture. I might talk about some of the federal spending that's going on. And then there's more going on facial recognition and surveillance. Just keeps coming every time I look through notes and articles and through my feed reader. More surveillance. Amazon has this plan to do these facial recognition doorbells that connect directly with police. And if they have a database then that has suspicious people, it'll automatically report people to police if they're on that list and you ring a doorbell or you come up to it. So that's an interesting one. I also saw that Google actually rejected. They've actually made a statement that they're not going to be providing their facial recognition to any businesses or governments, at least for the time being, which is tentatively positive, unlike Amazon, which is providing it to people. And as I noted in my last show on this, that when tested, it got 28 members of Congress incorrect, misidentified with the wrong people. So putting people on lists for this type of thing is really dangerous. So if you have ideas of things you'd like me to cover in the next couple of weeks or so, please either leave it in the comments or email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. Happy Bill of Rights Day tomorrow or whenever you happen to be tuning in on Saturday the 15th. And I'll see you next week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here at Good Morning Liberty. Have a great weekend, and thanks for tuning in.